week 2 of our 3-part series of how to develop a fleet safety policy. I'm here with Phil and also Kari Hagan. Kari Hagan is Senior Director of Client Development at Fleet Response. Kari, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, Phil, how are you doing? Having a good
I'm
week?
doing well, Bob. How are you doing?
Doing great. Yeah, happy to be
Good to
here
hear.
and kind of excited for this episode. We get into the nitty gritty of actually developing this policy. So, Kari, you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. My background is in business management and communications, but I have been in the safety world now for about 9 years. Day to day, working with different companies and looking at their safety programs and making recommendations and policy recommendations. And a lot has, changed in that 9 years, and technology has changed. And so, I'm happy to be here today and talk about best practices.
Yeah, no, that's great. As a fleet manager, I use Fleet Response, and we are very happy with, from my point of view, able to develop a program that we have, and then you guys can put something behind it. All your different clients do something different, so it's nice that you can do that. And then you probably learn a lot of different things that other companies are doing and can share that with other customers, so that's nice. So you mentioned some new things. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but the one that I really like is the MVR monitoring. We'll talk about the value of MVRs in a little bit here, but I do like the monitoring, and that's one of the new things that's changed, and I'm sure that we'll learn about some more. Phil, as we go and kind of talk about developing a policy and putting some teeth behind some of the language, from your experience as an officer and also in the industry and developing safety policy, what would you recommend as far as developing something that
you need to run MVRs? I mean, if you don't do anything else, run MVRs. But once you run those MVRs, you need to make sure that you have things in place to take care of what you find. And previous conversation I know the three of us had, it's worse to know and not do something than it is not to know. And not knowing is not acceptable. MVRs are a must if you're managing a fleet. But you need to know what the drivers are up to. But you better have something in place as soon as you find out, because if you see somebody with multiple violations or egregious violations, the DWIs and reckless drivings and things like that, you need to be able to react right away. And you have to make sure that, again, we talked about it last week, you have to have top-down buy-in from, make sure you have your legal department on board and your HR department and all the management, because it has to be enforced. So MVRs are a must.
Yeah, I think, when you put together that policy, you look at where are all the different areas we can get information that we might, and MVRs for sure. I would even say in today's world, monitoring at this point is almost becoming a must. Just it is really becoming best practice. So understand, if that's telematics, if it's just MVRs, if it's monitoring, claims, understand where the data is coming from, and then understand how you're going to react to each of those pieces, and then putting the players in place to be able to react timely to all of that, right? And whether that's a system or a third party or an internal team, and maybe it's a combination, but addressing all those pieces, knowing about it, and then having the keys to address it are really going to make you successful.
Yeah.
Right. So, Kari, I think that people need to also understand that not all of their collisions are going to show up on the MVR.
Right.
With a lot of the parking lot stuff, because there are two types of collisions: reportable and non-reportable. And most states have the same thing, so you have to find out, the particular states that you're dealing with. But I know where I worked as a police officer, we had two types of collisions: reportable, non-reportable. Reportable was somebody was injured or there was so much damage, vehicles had to be towed. And non-reportables were all the others. And for the parking lot collisions, my department, unlike a lot of the departments, we actually responded to private property collisions on parking lots in the strip malls and things like that, doctors' offices and people who back into things. and we would write an incident report, but that's not showing up on the MVR.
Right.
So again, I think your policy needs to address in reporting all collisions, and then though you have to make sure that when the MVR is run, there's not double reporting,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
On as far as like on a profile of the driver, which we'll get into that. Why we think that's important, that you have to have some type of system in place to just a readable report. I'll put it that way. Because some of these MVRs are like hieroglyphics. I mean, they're tough to read.
Yeah, a report, and it goes back to the consistency that was talked about in the first episode. You have to prove that you're treating everybody fairly across the board, that you're acting reasonably, that you have this really comprehensive safety story in place. That's and if you're looking at everyone individually, and you don't have to have a way to normalize it and treat everyone the same across the board consistently, then you're not going to meet that burden of proof at the end of the day. And frankly, it's harder for drivers to understand. If they don't know that this is what I need to follow, they're going to have a hard time following it. You got to make it really clear.
So you said the word normalize. Can you explain, like, what do you mean by that? Is that like with point scores?
Right. So MVRs is a great example, like you were saying. So different states look at, records so differently, driving records, and what California does and what Ohio does might be vastly different. So if you get a ticket for going 10 miles over the limit, the number of points on your license is going to really vary greatly. So you need a way to standardize that. So if you have drivers all over, the U.S., you want to make sure that you can treat them fairly, and you're not scoring them based on the number of points on their license, but looking at the violations and looking at your company policy and saying, based on our company policy, no matter what state you're in, if you get if you get a ticket for reckless driving, we're giving you X number of points. We're treating you this way, and if you get a ticket for going 10 miles over, then it's going to be X. So that puts them on that level playing field.
Okay. So it levels out the point scores,
Yep.
basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So Kari, all points, Phil. Thanks. But with the referring to company policy, is developing a company policy, so we have to kind of act like nobody has a policy right now. You brought up like New York could give points for being, Iowa could give points different. We're not treating them the same. So first of all, can you talk a little bit about monitoring, and then how do we get those violations and assign points to them? I know that we've got a whole spreadsheet of what they are called AVD codes, and then we assign our points that we do to them. And then you guys can actually put them out there as a policy. And I don't want to just tell you exactly how you're going to explain that, but I think it's going to be important. Someone who's kind of listening to this has no policy. What is monitoring, and then how do we get to those points?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the points, you really do need to do it by the codes that are assigned, which if you're with a company that has very many drivers of a substantial size, that might be hard to do on your own, and you might need to find some third party to help you out, whoever that is. So if you look at the points and standardizing and the codes and how you do that, if you're a company of any substantial size, you're probably going to need a third party vendor or partner or system to help you do that, because you do want to look at the codes that are assigned, and there's tens of thousands of codes across all the states in the U.S. So there's multiple third parties that can help you do that. But when it comes to your policy, you want to look at it at a higher level, and then you can roll all those. Your partner can help you roll all those points up to it. But you look at it, we always say the big uglies we talk about, which are those, the DUI, the alcohol, the road rage, the things that are, totally under your control, aggressive behaviors that you really want to address, right? So you put those in a category, and you're going to score those at one level. And then you look at the, different levels of speeding, and so you want to look at those categories and speak to them at a high level that drivers can really understand, of how they're going to be scored and graded. And then your partner can help you get the granular points attributed appropriately based on the categories of your policy. And historically, then it's been you run at least an annual MVR, right? And first of all, do people have a valid license? Like that's the basics, right? If they don't, you better know about it, and they better not be driving on your behalf. And then where are they at from a violation standpoint? But monitoring is something that's been out for a few years now, and I've really seen great improvements in the monitoring programs. So every state has their own version of it a little bit, what they monitor for, how often they monitor, but it's really been coming along where you can do it in every state now in the U.S. And when it first started, and we started pretty early with it, and it was a handful of states, and so some people were concerned about treating it differently by state, but monitoring is across the U.S. now, and really, it's just going to take that one time where you have a driver that gets a DUI. It's in your policy to self-report. They don't. And 8 months later, you find out somebody was driving on your behalf without a license.
DUI related.
Right.
Really bad.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So that monitoring program really, getting your drivers enrolled in that, it's a comfort, but it's also, you're doing the right thing on behalf of your drivers, on behalf of everyone else on the road. And it's, drivers don't have to question like, man, should I self-report this? What, like, the company's going to know about it. I'm going to self-report. We're going to figure this out. And it really, I think just keeps you up to date and lets you really manage it at a much higher level.
Yeah.
So getting to the point of self-reporting, and that's why I think, okay, call me cynical, right? But if somebody gets a pretty egregious violation, they're going to be very, very hesitant to report it to the company.
Right.
So I always say in the policy, you need to address that, and you need to let them know that, hey, if you haven't reported this violation and we will find out about it, there are going to be consequences to that. And it's going to be worse than if you had not reported it. But I believe that there are some people who just look at it and say, well, if it's a fireable offense, I'm going to try and get it wiped off my record before, it shows up. But I think that your policy better address that as well. And that's, if you don't follow policy on the self-reporting, then there are consequences for not doing that. And those have to be pretty stiff penalties so that you can, incentivize your employees to self-report. So that was another thing. And then, you said about the thousands of codes. So there are 50 states, and if you're dealing with Canada and all, vehicle codes are about that thick, right? So think about all of that. And every state has a different code for different violations. Some of the penalties might be the same, but yeah, it's really, really important that you have a system in place that, listen, whether it's 10 to 15 over in a 35 or 10 to 15 over in a 65, it's 10 to 15 over. And you need to have a balanced point score system in place so that it's manageable.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to have it manageable.
Mm-hmm. And, manageable and actionable.
Right.
So you need to be able to administer it. And then as talked about in the first episode, the only thing worse than, not knowing is knowing and not doing anything about it. And so then what are you going to do? And how do you make that manageable to execute on? So, you need to be able to say, hey, if we have drivers that hit this level and have these violations, and we need to give them training, and maybe that's an online lesson, and you partner with somebody to administer that. Maybe it's we've worked with companies that their branches do individual coaching, written conversations, coaching, documented in a system that, this happened, or a ride along. There's a few different ways you can approach it depending on the technology available to you and resources. And locations, and whether you're decentralized or all in one location, but doing something actionable that you can act on pretty immediately is just as important then.
Right.
Yeah. And Phil, you mentioned earlier a driver profile. So Kari, I know that Fleet Response has driver history profile.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But that profile, what does it tell us? I mean, we have to assign some sort of risk level to a driver. And that risk level basically is saying, what are the chances that person could be involved in a preventable accident? More than likely is what we're trying to get to. What recommendations can you come up with or recommend for these risk levels, and how do we get there?
Is that to Kari?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I think you go back to look at what are you scoring and how are you scoring that, and then you put your drivers in those categories. So you're going to have, most of the time I see 80% of drivers are clear. 80% of drivers, have nothing on their record.
Right.
Then you're going to get this probably 15% that has something here and there. They'll have maybe one preventable accident, maybe a few speeding tickets, and then it's usually really a small percent that has those big uglies or the repeat offenders that you see. So you set those categories and those breakdowns, and then you figure out how you're going to address each. And I would say it's pretty obvious that those high offenders, there's a repeatable behavior there that you need to address. And whether that's termination or whether that's coaching and training, you need to address it and follow a consistent policy across the board and let the policy guide the action. But I would really recommend, even 80% of your drivers are clear, but that's also your largest population, and they have a bad day, something happens in their personal life. It is not uncommon. We'll see somebody who's been clear for 7 years, and then all of a sudden there's this activity that happens. So that speaks to acting quickly, figuring out, again, it's not always even just about penalizing, it's just addressing, right? You're there to support the driver, and you want them to get home safe. You want everyone else on the roadway to be safe. Our social responsibility as humans, and that safety story, we're including everyone. So that's why we would always recommend, I would always recommend, whether it's you're sending out regular safety messages, you're doing regular training, you are doing something to have it in the forefront of people's minds and remind them of the importance of being safe. Along with, then you say, okay, my highest percentage here, we're going to address them, in these 5 ways, in these 3 ways. This middle group, we're addressing each one of those incidents, and then the general population, what are we doing to continue that conversation?
Kari, I think you bring up a really, really good point here. I've seen drivers who 6, 7 years, nothing, and then all of a sudden, bang, 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 violations, crashes, whatever. And it could be a personal thing. They're going through a health issue, or they have a loved one who is, or they're going through a divorce, or they just lost a loved one, or they're going through a personal crisis. And again, this needs to be brought forth, to the drivers that, hey, we're here because we want you to be safe. I mean, that's number one. Obviously, protecting your company or your organization from the negligent entrustment issues, obviously that's important. But number one is, we want you to stay safe. The most important thing you do is you go home every night, right? And if I think if you approach it that way with drivers, most of them do really, accept that and quite often are appreciative. I know that the company I worked for previously, when we put the policy in place and the training in place, I got numerous emails from people saying thank you. So it's, the push, people think, oh no, but they're never going to accept that. No, a lot of people actually do appreciate it. And having the consistency, as you mentioned, Kari, I think is very important, because you know what? If you were to stop and think right now, think of a bad driver, somebody is just a terrible driver that you wouldn't let your dog ride around the block with. Think about that. You probably have maybe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 people come in mind, right? Well, guess what? The employees know who those employees are. And they're wondering, like, wow, he got away with it. He did that or she did that. And it, irritates them, and that creates a bad work environment. Having a solid policy in place and monitoring those MVRs and identifying the people who need help, I think is a good thing for on a number of different levels, and that's just another one. So I think that your point of the 80-20, oh my goodness, that is so true. There are people who just
As I
love
was
to contribute to the
saying.
cause, And I've done
Mm-hmm.
ride-alongs with a number of the risk level drivers. Sometimes I felt like I needed to wear a helmet, but some of these people are really just kind of dangerous. And the point is too is that it's their habits. And until you point it out and say, hey, you need to correct this, you need to correct your behavior, a lot of times they don't even realize they're doing something wrong until you bring it forth to them and then help them.
And when you set up those, when you set that up for your company, I think this is where it's really individual by company. You have to figure out from an administrative burden standpoint, from the buy-in, what can you do that is going to be achievable, obtainable, that you're going to be able to carry that consistency across the board. So, we love to work with clients and set up the automation, so if we get a motor vehicle record back and there are, violations for speeding, we're going to automatically send you this training lesson for speeding, if there's a preventable accident, and you rear-ended somebody else, we want to automatically give you a training lesson for avoiding rear-end collisions. Right. And so whether you work with a third party to set up that automation, or you can, set it up at an employee manager level, you really need to make sure it's timely and that it's not going to be something that you can't take on from an administrative standpoint.
Right. Yeah, and I always say automation, right? For just the same reason, consistent enforcement of the policies. That's one, and then two is that hey, the more human interaction you have with those things, I find the more mistakes are made. So if you have an automated system like that, it flows a lot better. It's more readily accepted. Say, hey, listen, the senior VP got the same thing you did, so I don't want to hear it. It's
right.
like, it just needs to be consistent, and that automation assists in that in achieving that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is great. This is all really good advice. So if we have a company that doesn't have any kind of safety policy, and they're trying to develop this, we talked in the last episode of developing a fleet safety committee, getting senior level people on board, getting HR, legal. So they should be reviewing these steps that we just talked about as part of that committee, right? They want to talk about how many points they want to assign on speeding tickets, on the big bad DUIs and other ones. I can't remember exactly the term you used for it. The baddies?
The big uglies.
The big uglies.
Yeah.
I like that. So obviously those are going to be weighted heavier as far as a score than somebody going 10 miles over a speed limit or something like that. And then you have to determine, how far back are you going to, hold someone accountable for these points. So that's going to be kind of a big thing too. Again, as Cliff said last week, we want to make sure it's reasonable, but also manageable. We need to make sure, we're able to manage this. So, perhaps you don't want to look at 7 years back and give someone points for something that old, but you certainly want to make it relevant to today's everyday driving. So from a third party standpoint, you said it's good to partner with somebody like this that can automate these things. As a company or an organization that's developing a fleet safety policy and they're working with the fleet safety committee, do you guys work with, organizations developing policy to kind of give advice or kind of help them establish something, to do that?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And because it can help to have that outside opinion, right? You need both sides. You need to know what's really going to work for your company and have buy-in and be realistic for your culture, what's going to be accepted. But we work with lots of companies, and we can talk about best in class, and that's the importance of that third party. Whether it's fleet response and the legal side, HR side, you want to get all those players involved, and we absolutely we always say, let's meet and talk about it. We'll help you even write one, or you guys write one and we'll review it and we'll say, what about this? or, there isn't really consistency here, or this doesn't align. So we're always happy to partner and do that. And it's important that whatever, third party you work with is willing to offer something like that and be really consultative with you.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's great. Okay.
Yeah, one of the other things I always say, Kari, is that people, I know that there have been some organizations that they have people reviewing MVRs, and they see a violation on the MVR and it says per se, and they don't know what per se is, and what per se is a DWI. It's the per se level of intoxication, like a 0.08 or a 0.05, depending on where you're living. And so I think it's really important that you have a report that takes care of that for you, so that you're not depending on somebody who may not have the experience in deciphering what an MVR is saying. So I think that's an important thing also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. If somebody is doing it manually, that I don't envy that. That is a hard task. And if you're getting it, directly from the state, every state's
Different.
MVR looks different too, and is in a little bit different format. You're searching for information. We take the information in a totally electronic format, and then the output is a standard format regardless of the state you're in. Because you have people that maybe don't understand all the violation specifics, what it's even saying. But there's human error too, right? If you're reviewing it manually, and then and there's biases, as much as you want to say that isn't there, well, gosh, I know this guy,
He's a
and
great sales guy,
really bad
right? I know. Yeah.
Right. We, the commission, we've had companies that have said, what do I do? Like, this is our highest producing sales person. We can't take them off the road. And we say, then you get him a driver. Then you get him or her somebody to drive them. I mean, really, like at some point, you have to have a policy that's clear enough that, to some degree there aren't exceptions. You have to be consistent.
Right. Yeah. There was another part. So, look, going back, Bob, you brought up about how far back you look. What I've always heard, and what I did previously, was we did a 3-year look back for all the violations except for the more egregious ones, like the DWI and fleeing and eluding. We did a 5-year look back for that. Do you find that is typically the what most organizations are doing? What have you seen, Kari?
Yeah, a 3-year look back, I think, is the most common. I've seen some people do 12. I would say that
you can get that
12. You can do, but you're not necessarily getting a full picture.
Mm-hmm.
You want the longer period of time is better. States, it depends on the state on how far back they'll report as well. So you go much beyond 3, you're going to start to lose some states as what they'll report to you. And so then, are you being consistent? So 3 years, I think, is definitely the most common. I've had people, and we've worked with companies to stagger it and say, your points start off at this, and then at year 2, they move to this, and at year 1, move to this. My only hesitation there is that gets confusing.
Yeah.
That even if you have an automated system that does all that, I go back to the basics of, I do think, and this was mentioned in the last episode, that drivers want to know what the standard is, and they're happy to have one and follow it most of the time. And you got to keep it simple. So if you put too many ifs, thens at this point and variations in, then it gets complex and it gets really hard to follow.
Especially with the continuous monitoring, I could see where that is going to be extremely difficult to manage, right? Because when it's run again, if something happens again and it runs it, it's going to pop up again. And if you have a policy that, well, this is going to go down to 2 points to 1 point after so many years, I think, no, I wouldn't suggest doing that. I guess there are organizations that do, but I just got to believe that that's going to create some issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the 2 weeks in a row we've talked about the drivers, and the drivers are looking for some sort of structure. They're not really going to push back against this. They're looking at what are the expectations that the company has, for me and other drivers Phil, you brought up a great point. It's like, hey, I know Joe's, he's out there doing everything wrong. He's not getting caught.
Mm-hmm.
Why should I try? So as long as everybody knows what their expectations are and it's clear and it makes sense and people are being treated reasonably and consistently, I think that, any good safety policy is going to be put in place in such a way that drivers are going to accept it and expect it and be grateful for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say real quick is that one thing we just haven't mentioned is looking at it from the perspective of assisting the drivers and rewarding good
Yes.
behavior over penalizing
Yes.
bad, right? The approach can be so important. And there are, again, this goes back to the company culture and what you're able to do. But we have companies that, have committees that annually, semi-annually, whether it's monetary, whether it's, a plaque, but recognition, um, incentivizing the good behavior, gamification. We're actually working on a new site right now to building gamification so that you can, it's a whole, you feel good, you get a badge, you get again, money, days off, whatever the company has as incentive, and it can be small, speaks to employees, and speaking that instead of you do this and you're in trouble is such a different message.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
always
that's a
say,
great point.
it just can't be all stick. You have to give the carrot too, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
things that I'd looked at was like, satellite radio, because if they fall off the cliff,
Right.
they start doing things wrong. We can just turn that off, But again, just the recognition, Kari. You're so right. I've been to a number of larger company, the national meetings and such. Just having them being called up onto the stage by the president of the company and shaking their hand and giving them a
Yeah.
little certificate, it means a lot. And people were like really proud of that. And that might sound, oh, but sure. No, I'm telling you, it's kind of like a peer thing. And that because doesn't that lead to that driver safety culture that we're always talking about? So I agree, Kari. I'm really glad you brought that up, because you do have to reward the good ones too. They should get the recognition. If the only time they're hearing from their fleet or safety manager is when they've done something wrong, we got a problem.
Yeah. That's a great point. I like the idea of the gamification.
Yes.
Um, but Carrie, as you mentioned, a lot of companies, 80% of their drivers could have a perfect record. So make sure you have a
Yep.
budget and make sure that it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
reasonable, because if everybody's getting
Yep.
$50, that's going to cost you a fortune.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think a lot of times drivers just like the recognition,
Yeah.
just being recognized, just
Yeah.
being called out, saying, "Hey, you did great," something, and just make sure it's something that if you're going to do it, put something in the budget, put something in place, to get that going. So, and if you don't do something, if you don't have a policy and you do have a huge accident, just look at how much that's going to cost from the liability side and everything else. So, and I'm sure that we don't budget for those. So the money's there one way or another. So just, make sure it's reasonable. Yep. So, yeah. Well, what else do we want to chat about? We're kind of approaching our quote unquote 30-minute, time limit here. Are there any last thoughts or anything that we missed that we want to continue talking about?
Well, we mentioned about how often MVRs are run, right? Annual, semi-annual, or continuous monitoring. And Kari, you said at every state now you can do continuous monitoring. And I know, again, in a previous conversation we had, I think attorneys are going to start jumping on this. If you don't have that in place, and you do, let's say you run MVRs on January 2nd, and then on January 3rd the person gets a DWI, and they don't self-report, you may not find out about that until something happens, or a year later you run the MVR. And you could have had a person driving around on a suspended DWI suspension license. They bump into somebody, you're driving for corporate business, or you're driving for your organization's business. In this society, where we're very, very litigious, we should have Cliff back on to talk about that. But on that person's suspended, they shouldn't have even been out there. So that's why I think continuous monitoring is pretty important in my opinion. But have you found that most organizations are going towards that, Kari?
I really have, and I don't know that I would have said that even a year ago. But today, I mean, any new client we're talking to that doesn't have a policy and is putting one in place, um, I'm hearing, yeah, we know we need to do it, or tell me more about that, right? And clients that I've worked with for a long time, most of those have even moved over at this point, and because it really is just becoming such a best practice, that just makes a ton of sense. I mean, you mentioned budget, that's important, and it's going to cost a little more to have that real time information, but you get that one DUI, that one person out there with a
Yep.
suspended license that you didn't know about, and it's going to pay for itself pretty quickly. So it it really is becoming best practice. And one other thing to mention we didn't really talk about is when we say driver, that's a pretty general term. There's another question I get asked a lot is, so does it only matter if they're driving a company vehicle? Um, and if they are driving on behalf of company business, you need to know that that they're covered, that they have a license, a valid license. And so, you know, we talk to a lot of companies about whether it's your fleet, whether it's a reimbursement policy you have. Um, you really need to look at anybody driving on company
Karen, I'm so
business.
glad you brought that up. That's such a valid point. I'm glad we didn't miss that point. The gray fleet, right? And then even I've seen some
Mm-hmm.
organizations even now, so they have the person who mans the front desk. They run out and they get things for the company, and then they drive back. Well, if they're driving out, guess what? They're going out to pick something up, or whatever. I don't know. And now they're driving back and they get involved in a crash. They run a red light and hit somebody. You know, they're and you've seen it, right? The depositions. I mean, they find out everything. I mean, depositions are like the Inquisition. I mean, they put you under the spotlight, and I've been given enough depositions over the years. They find out, why were you on this road at this time? What were you doing? And they'll find out. And if they find out that you were running out on company business, and they say, well, and then they'll find out, well, did you have a valid license? Well, no, I didn't. Why didn't the company know about that? There's so much exposure there, and let alone the people who are on the road every day, the so-called gray fleets and those employees.
Mm-hmm.
But really, you might want to look at anybody who drives for any reason for your organization. And that might sound extreme, but again, get legal involved, ask them, see what they think about it, and I think I know which way they'll roll.
Yeah. So I want to talk about that from a fleet manager perspective, which I am. And I have anybody who follows fleet policy, which is our gray fleet, our reimbursed fleet. They drive their personal vehicle, but they have to follow fleet policy as a fleet driver. And then, of course, anybody in a company vehicle. Where I don't do this is somebody who has goes out and drives to a conference under IRS mileage, right? They're not a fleet driver. I can't hold them to policy. It doesn't mean the company cannot run an MVR or do something. Maybe that's under travel or maybe it's under your expense. But it's a good point. If anybody is out there driving and they're driving for the company, even if it's mileage reimbursement, on the IRS rate, or they're in a rental car, they are driving for the company and it could have some exposure out there. So you're going to have to find a way. And I don't know if that's going to be on this episode, but it's certainly something to think about because this is developing a fleet safety policy. So we can cover all the drivers who follow that policy. But from an organizational point of view, you're going to have to find a way to reduce that exposure for all of your drivers. And actually, we're working on that, Kari. You know that we're working on something for our travel driver fleet. There's one group that is in a rental for 30 plus days. So, we're trying to work with them. We are running MBRs. We're doing that. That could be the start of a travel policy, but we need to work with travel and fleet, to kind of work on that. But that's something that should not be ignored. Absolutely correct.
Yeah, and Bob, are you handling that? Is that coming onto your desk?
It is, but
Okay,
I
so
don't have the information of the rental
mhm,
car. The accident's not reported to me if they're
right.
involved in an accident, but we are running MVRs. We are taking action if they do have violations. And the whole idea is not to hit them with a stick, but to let them know that we're looking
Right.
And to, let them know that there's going to be some accountability. We're also giving them the training that they need. We're
Good.
not just putting them out there and beating them down if they get a speeding ticket, but they do have a lot of windshield time behind a rental car. So, yeah.
Yeah. That you have drivers who, employees who travel a lot, and they get into the rental cars, and they may be driving a car that they're not familiar in an area that they're not familiar with.
Right.
And
Yep.
Technology
right,
they're not
exactly.
familiar
The
with.
ADAS, and oh, it vibrated. Like, that's why I crashed. I mean, so it's so Bob, you make a really good point. Are you providing training for those people, and are you running MVRs for those people, and who's going to handle that? You're going to have to work with maybe your travel department to find out, and who those people are and help them.
If you have a health and safety department, rely on them.
Yeah.
Get them involved and see what they can do to kind of help manage that. Because if you're I'm a small department, but there's thousands of people at the company that could travel outside of the fleet policy. I cannot manage all of them in my department. Other departments need to come in and kind of be a part of it, but they can fall back on your fleet policy, which is exactly what this one travel department did. They pulled components out of the fleet policy and they developed a travel policy for them, and it's consistent. I think from Cliff's point of view, what's reasonable is I have a fleet policy where I am running MVRs and taking action on all fleet drivers, and that's reasonable. I mean, if your company has 18,000 people and 18,000 people could, be on IRS mileage reimbursement, maybe that's not so reasonable to have them fall under a fleet policy, but doing something, to reduce liability with those drivers is something you should look into.
And to keep them safe, Bob.
Absolutely. And the public, we don't want irresponsible people out there doing something bad. We want to make sure that they have a license, keep everybody safe. Absolutely. Right. So, all right. Well, good point. Glad we brought that up because that's a really important one.
It's a really good point.
Yeah. What else we got?
I'd say the one other thing, it's about keeping everybody safe. One thing, we worked with a company one time where we offered training even to children, of employees. It was a special, targeted safety initiative by that company. But you talk about just the appreciation of people, and they were like, I have this 16-year-old, and I know they're taking driver's ed, or this 18-year-old that did it 2 years ago, and gosh, I love that I can, have a resource. You speak to, again, the positive side of it, everyone going home at day, and those reimbursed drivers that don't drive as often, that you might not have a structured plan for. The one thing we haven't talked much about, but at the end of the day, it's the phone, it's texting, it's distractions, right? That is what's driving it. And man, if we could get that through to everybody, especially those people that it's not second nature, that they don't think much about it, they get in the car to run an errand and that's it. Man, if to hammer that point home and to have that culture where they know how important it is to you as a company to not drive distracted, wouldn't we all be in a better place? That's the goal at the end of the day.
No, that's a really valid point. To have your company, say that they care about you and making sure that you're safe, but you also care about your family and, offering something to children. Right. But also, what about if a spouse is allowed to drive?
Right.
So great, right. You have spouse privileges, but you're not going to put them through any kind of training. Maybe you should, because every time they're in that vehicle, there's a liability. Plus, there's an opportunity for them to be injured. So that makes a lot of sense there too. In fact, you brought up the companies that do that. We were sending out the safety blasts every other week, and it went to fleet drivers, and it also went to the levels of management. And everybody saw it. Well, our president, he learned from the last episode, president and CEO of our company at the time, liked the safety training so much. He participated, but he also saw the safety blast and said every employee in the company needs to receive this. So then, we ended up sending it through corporate communications, and we had to kind of change the message to make it match globally because, celebrating 4th of July means nothing to anybody in the UK, except for maybe a couple hundred years ago. So, we had to, kind of globalize the message and just make it more generic. But yeah, that's a really good point. There's other people, impacted by a driver, and that's their family members, so sharing information with them, could be very valuable. I like that.
Yeah, the organization I worked for previously, the spouse domestic partners who drove company assets, company vehicles, they had to go through the same training and had the MVRs,
Yep.
continuous monitoring, just like the employee did. And if they, and then the policy we had is if they had any violations, they were out of the car. But that was, they're not the employee. They don't need to drive that vehicle as part of their employment, as part of to get their job done. So I think it's a real privilege to allow a spouse domestic partner. I would urge companies do not allow children, driver age children, to drive the company vehicle. I hope they don't do that, but there are
Yeah.
some organizations that do. And if they do, you need to make sure that those people are, those kids, those driver age children are doing the same things as the employee.
I think if you're developing safety policy, the first thing you have in there is only an employee can drive a car. You don't want contractors or temps or any other people driving a company vehicle. If you're going to make the exception for a spouse domestic partner, you're going to need to strengthen your policy and include something with them. We have something similar that removes them permanently from driving a company vehicle
Right.
if their risk level increases.
Right.
Last thing is we have drivers in Canada, right? When is monitoring coming to Canada, Kari? Never.
Gosh. Um, you I, you know, every province is interesting to deal with, right? Although I will say I have seen improvements. Quebec is an easier process than it used to be, and that can be one of
Right.
the toughest areas, just from a what's required to even get an abstract back, right? But I think it's going to be a long time before it is across all of Canada. But again, every day, I mean, technology changes. We're moving in the right direction for sure. So I think, you still have to do your due diligence. And in Canada, we run, we get abstracts back and we still um, score them and we really still normalize it. And you need to do what you can. And maybe that's just running it a little more often until you get all the provinces caught up where you can be in more real time.
Yeah, no, that's great. Hopefully Canada does something soon. It seems like they tend to follow suit. They're a very mature fleet market. There's a lot of opportunities there. So hopefully something will happen there soon. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up here. It's really important, that we just say, these steps are, there's so much more you can do to develop a safety policy. Last week we talked about, developing, getting all the stakeholders involved, getting a safety committee, start talking about what you're trying to solve. This week we went a little more. This is the meat of what you can do. You have to run MBRs. You have to know somebody has a license. You have to know if they increase in risk level. You have to establish the risk level. You have to assign points to certain violations. When you get there, then you're going to take action. Are you going to do some proactive training and do reactive training? We talked about that a little bit last week. That would be part of this year. Next week, we're going to talk about implementation, and we're going to have another special guest on, a fleet manager who's implemented a fleet safety policy. And we're going to kind of tie all this together. But this is not the one stop. This is not what everybody does. This is just giving you high level information that you can use to put some sort of policy together. Every guest that we have on here, I think, Kari, I'm sure that I don't want to speak for you, but I'm sure that if somebody reached out, even if they're not a customer of Fleet Response, can probably, help develop some language or some wording or give you ideas on what you need to do to develop a safety policy. We're, Phil and I, we say that we are only doing this podcast because we want to give back. We want to help. Phil, we hate crashes, right? We just, hate crashes.
They run lives.
We want everybody, they ruin lives. Yep. Not just the person who was involved, but the family members and other people.
Family.
We want to keep that from happening. So this safety policy series is really, a step in that direction to kind of help put some tools in your lap to kind of reduce accidents and keep drivers safe. So next week will be the final episode in this series, and again, I think it's going to tie everything together. But Kari, thank you so much for your contribution on this. I think that it's very valuable what you've offered.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate coming on, and I agree. If everyone can get home safe at the end of the day, that is all of our goals, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, we'll sign off here. And Phil, any last words?
Nope. Just everybody be safe. There's a lot of crazy crazy things going on our roads these days. I mean, some just horrendous crashes that have occurred in the past week. Everybody just pay attention. Don't drive impaired. Right? Be safe, and hopefully we'll maybe be able to give you some more information next week that will help to keep you safe.
Yeah. And I don't think any episode would be complete without saying don't drive selfish.
Don't
Be a
drive
selfish
selfish.
driver.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. And until next week, have a great, safe week.